There is a certain type of person who can be surrounded by people and still feel as though they are the only one truly conscious of what is happening. Not superior, not inferior, simply different. As if everyone else is immersed in the story while they are standing just outside of it, observing every detail unfold. No matter how hard they try to step fully into that experience, something always draws them back. Back to silence. Back to reflection. Back to themselves. Back to a solitude the world has spent years insisting needs to be corrected. This message is not meant for everyone. If your days are filled with constant plans, endless notifications, and a social life that never seems to slow down, these words may not resonate the way they are intended to. But if you have ever stared at your contacts, scrolled through familiar names, and felt absolutely no urge to reach out, not because you were hurt, not because you were lonely, but because something inside you quietly recognized that very few people truly connect with words, then stay here. Because what you are about to hear may finally explain something you have carried silently for a very long time. Most people are taught to believe that having only a few friends is evidence that something is missing, that somewhere along the journey they failed a test everyone else seemed to complete effortlessly. Maybe they were too emotional, too serious, too complicated, or somehow not enough. Society hands people an invisible scorecard where relationships are counted like trophies, and by those standards some people feel as though they never measured up. But the most painful part is rarely the isolation itself. The most painful part is the meaning you begin attaching to it, the conclusions you draw about yourself because of it. What few people realize is that there exists a particular psychological makeup, uncommon, highly specific, and often misunderstood, that naturally leads a person toward a smaller social circle. Not because they are incapable of connection, not because they are afraid of people, but because of the unique way they are designed to experience human interaction. And once that becomes clear, everything starts to look different. Not only your relationships, but your entire understanding of who you are. Empaths experience the world through a level of emotional awareness many people never encounter. When someone enters a room carrying pain they have not yet spoken about, the empath often senses it long before any words are exchanged. When a conversation shifts from authentic to artificial, when sincerity quietly gives way to performance, they notice the exact second it happens. Not as a thought, but as a feeling. Almost like sensing a change in atmosphere before a storm arrives. And this is not simply imagination. Studies in social neuroscience suggest that highly sensitive individuals process emotional information with greater depth and involvement across multiple regions of the brain. What they pick up on is not invented. They are simply receiving more emotional data than the average person around them. Now consider what that means every time they interact with others. For most people, a conversation is just a conversation. For an empath, it becomes something much larger. They are not only listening to words, they are absorbing emotional undercurrents, sensing hidden needs, monitoring the emotional climate of the environment, and simultaneously managing their own internal reactions. All of that is happening at once. Then they return home feeling drained in a way that rest alone does not completely solve. This is where many people misunderstand empaths, who have only a handful of close friends. They assume the smaller circle exists because something is lacking, a missing social skill, an old emotional wound, a fear of getting close to others disguised as independence. But when you step back and look more carefully, an entirely different reality begins to appear. A small social circle is not evidence that someone struggles to connect. More often, it reflects an exceptionally high standard for what connection truly is. You have likely sat through conversations that felt rehearsed rather than real. You have probably maintained friendships where every interaction required you to filter yourself first, to soften your honesty, hide your depth, dilute your intensity, and keep certain thoughts locked away because they felt too much for the people around you. You smiled when expected. You laughed at the appropriate moments. You attended the gatherings, replied to the messages, played the role everyone seemed comfortable with. Yet afterward, as you drove home or sat alone in silence, there was that familiar feeling, a loneliness that somehow felt heavier than if you had spent the entire day by yourself. And eventually, something shifted. Not through an argument, not through a dramatic ending, not through a grand declaration. You simply stopped. You stopped forcing your presence into places where your spirit felt absent. because somewhere along the way, you discovered a truth most people spend their lives trying not to face. There is a unique kind of loneliness that comes from being misunderstood in a crowded room, and that loneliness weighs far more than the solitude of your own company. That is not isolation. That is discernment. And understanding the difference changes everything. Few people explain this distinction clearly. Isolation is often fear disguised as preference. It is withdrawing because people feel unsafe, because vulnerability feels risky, because connection threatens to expose parts of yourself you are trying to protect. Isolation makes your world smaller. It separates you from experiences and relationships you genuinely desire. Beneath it, there is usually pain, an unmet longing, a quiet ache that never fully leaves. Discernment operates differently. Discernment is choice. It comes from understanding who you are and recognizing the emotional cost of authentic connection. It understands what deserves your energy and what does not. There is a calmness inside discernment, a certainty. You are not avoiding connection. You are declining imitation. You are refusing substitutes. And that refusal, that unwavering unwillingness to settle for something that only resembles connection, is often the reason an empath ends up with a social world that is small, quiet, and remarkably genuine. Perhaps the real question is not why empaths have fewer friends. Perhaps the real question is why society has spent so much time treating that reality like a pulled up instead of a message. Because signals carry meaning. And when you learn how to interpret this one, it does not point toward deficiency. It points toward rarity. It points toward something many people spend their entire lives searching for in crowded gatherings, endless conversations, and countless relationships without ever discovering. A relationship with themselves. A connection to their own inner world that is so honest, so grounded, and so complete that the constant external stimulation begins to feel less like comfort and more like distraction. You are not someone who failed at friendship. You are someone who cannot pretend. And in a culture built heavily on performance, appearances, and social habits that often lack depth, that quality is far more significant than most people realize. It is not something that needs fixing. It is direction. It is guidance. It is a compass pointing toward a different way of living. And where that compass leads is what the rest of this journey is about. There comes a point in the life of nearly every empath, a moment they can usually recognize once it is described, even if they never had language for it before. It rarely arrives in a single instant. Instead, it forms slowly, across years, across countless rooms, across conversations that began with hope but ended with that familiar emptiness lingering in an empty chest. The realization is simple, yet life-changing. Being surrounded by people does not automatically make you feel connected, and once you truly understand that, there is no going back. You cannot unknow it. Something inside you reorganizes itself. The way you enter social situations changes. The way you assess relationships changes. The way you decide who receives your energy changes. Most people never experience this shift because they never feel the contrast strongly enough. Empaths do. For them, the difference is unmistakable. It is the difference between existing comfortably in your own skin and constantly adjusting yourself to fit a space that was never designed for you. Once you experience that contrast clearly, returning to the old way becomes nearly impossible. And this is where the real story of the empath with few friends begins. Not with shyness, not with rejection, not with some unresolved wound from the past, but with awareness. It starts with perception, with the simple reality that empaths experience social situations at a depth most people never made. Imagine two people walking into the same room. One person sees enough to navigate comfortably. They recognize the furniture, find a place to sit, interact with the people around them, and leave without much thought. The empath enters that same room and immediately notices far more. They notice the tension hidden beneath someone's smile, the hesitation before a response, the subtle shift in mood when a certain person speaks, the emotions people are trying to hide and the feelings they do not even realize they are broadcasting. They are taking in details that others pass by without a second glance. And while that sounds like a gift, it rarely feels effortless. Because heightened awareness comes with a price. In friendships, seeing more means noticing more. You notice when someone's words do not align with what they actually feel. You notice when they insist everything is okay while carrying stress in every movement. You notice the forced laugh, the delayed response, the carefully chosen phrase that conceals something deeper underneath. You catch the details, all of them. And once you become aware of those details, you cannot simply switch that awareness off. That is why social interactions often require far more energy from an empath than people realize. While others are hearing a conversation, you are reading layers beneath it. While others are focused on the obvious, you are tracking the invisible. You are constantly interpreting emotional signals, noticing subtle changes, and responding to currents most people never even detect. That level of attention becomes its own form of labor. And the difficult part is that very few people recognize it. Even fewer return it. This creates one of the most unspoken forms of loneliness an empath experiences. You often give people a depth of attention they rarely receive anywhere else. You listen beyond their words. You notice what they avoid saying. You recognize emotions they are struggling to express. People feel understood around you. It is why complete strangers sometimes reveal personal stories after only a brief conversation. It is why people often describe your presence as calming, safe, or unusually genuine. Something about being seen without judgment allows them to lower their guard. But what happens when the person who sees everyone else is rarely seen themselves? What happens when you spend years understanding people who never truly understand you? Very few individuals will notice your emotional shifts with the same accuracy. Very few will ask the questions you instinctively ask. Very few will pay attention to your inner world the way you naturally pay attention to theirs. And over time, that imbalance begins to wear on you. Giving depth while receiving surface-level engagement eventually becomes exhausting. Not because you expect perfection, not because you demand constant attention, but because relationships cannot thrive indefinitely when understanding only travels in one direction. So slowly, almost without realizing it, you begin letting certain connections fade. There is no dramatic conflict, no major fallout, no final argument. You simply stop investing energy where nothing meaningful is being built. And as that happens, your circle becomes smaller. From the outside, people often misunderstand what they are seeing. They assume you are distant, difficult, overly selective, too demanding, too guarded. Some may even decide that you are afraid of intimacy, and after hearing those assumptions enough times, you may begin questioning yourself. You wonder whether they are right. Maybe the reason relationships keep fading is because something is wrong with you. Maybe you are too emotional, too particular, too aware, too unwilling to accept people as they are. But that interpretation misses the truth entirely. Empaths do not end up with fewer friends because they refuse to meet people where they are. More often they end up with fewer friends because they spent years doing exactly that. They adjusted. They understood. They empathized. They gave. They carried emotional weight that was never theirs to carry. And eventually they realized how rarely that effort was being returned. That realization changes everything. Not because it makes you cynical. Not because it makes you stop caring. But because it teaches you the value of your own energy. That is not being closed off. That is wisdom earned through experience. It is the understanding that comes after enough one-sided relationships have shown you the same lesson repeatedly. And recognizing a pattern is not the same thing as giving up on people. It is choosing not to lose yourself trying to save every connection. There is a unique clarity that arrives once you stop forcing relationships that were never truly mutual. It is not bitterness. It is not resentment. It feels much lighter than that. Almost as if a constant background noise suddenly disappears. A fog that has been hanging over your life quietly lifts. And for the first time in a long while, you can hear yourself clearly. Your preferences, your boundaries, your natural rhythm, your genuine needs, without the pressure of maintaining connections that never felt right to begin with. You begin to recognize the difference between what genuinely nourishes you and what merely fills empty space. And that distinction changes far more than your social life. It changes the way you live. You begin to recognize that solitude and loneliness are not the same thing. For most of your life, the world may have treated them as if they were interchangeable, as though every moment spent alone automatically meant something was missing. But the longer you pay attention, the more obvious the difference becomes. Loneliness is the feeling of being disconnected. Solitude is the experience of being connected to yourself. And for an empath, those are completely different realities. Time alone is rarely empty. In fact, it is often the fullest part of the day. It becomes the place where you process everything you absorbed from the world around you. The emotions, the conversations, the energies, the subtle details that most people never even noticed. It is where you no longer have to adjust yourself to fit the expectations of a room. You do not have to manage anyone else's mood. You do not have to monitor the atmosphere. You do not have to translate yourself into something easier for others to understand. You simply get to exist as you are, at your own pace, at your own depth, in your own emotional rhythm. That is not a backup plan for failed relationships. It is not a consolation prize. It is a necessity, just as real as sleep, just as essential as rest. And treating that need as evidence that something is wrong is no different than criticizing someone for needing recovery after exhaustion. The empaths who eventually understand this stop apologizing for the size of their social circle, not because relationships stop mattering, not because connection becomes unimportant, but because they finally realize that connection was never a numbers game. Depth and quantity have never been the same thing. One relationship where you can be completely yourself, fully understood, fully accepted, fully known without editing your thoughts, shrinking your personality, or hiding your true complexity, is worth more than dozens of relationships built around a version of yourself, designed to keep everyone comfortable. That realization changes everything, and once it arrives, much of your past begins to make sense in a way it never did before. There is a question buried underneath almost every empath's social experience. Most never ask it directly. Many never consciously notice it at all. Yet it quietly exists beneath every friendship that faded, every gathering that left them drained, and every relationship that slowly dissolved without any dramatic ending. The question is not, why do I have so few friends? That is only the surface layer. The deeper question is this: why does being truly understood feel so uncommon when understanding others comes so naturally to me? That question sits at the center of the empath experience, because there is often a painful imbalance between how deeply you perceive other people and how rarely people perceive you with the same depth. And until that imbalance is acknowledged honestly, it is easy to mistake it for a personal flaw. But it is not a flaw. It is often the result of a mismatch between the kind of connection you seek and the kind of connection most people are accustomed to creating. For many people, connection develops horizontally. It grows through repeated exposure, shared routines, shared environments, shared experiences. You attend the same school, work in the same office, live in the same neighborhood. Spend enough time together and familiarity gradually becomes friendship. There is nothing wrong with that. It serves an important purpose. It creates belonging, community, a sense of social stability. But it is largely built around external experiences, around what people do together, rather than who they are beneath the surface. And for many individuals, that is enough. That is what friendship feels like. That is what connection means. For an empath, however, something deeper is usually being sought, even long before you had words for it. Even as a child, you were rarely satisfied with simple proximity. You wanted to know what existed underneath the performance. You were curious about the thoughts people kept hidden, the fears they never voiced, the questions they carried privately, the parts of themselves they only revealed when their guard finally dropped. Not because you were fascinated by pain, but because that was where people felt real. That was where connection stopped feeling scripted. That was where something authentic began. While others were often looking outward, you were instinctively looking inward. You were searching for depth, for what could be called vertical connection, a connection that moves downward into honesty rather than outward into familiarity. And the challenge is that most social environments are not designed for that. They are designed for comfort, for efficiency, for keeping interactions light and manageable. Small talk, group conversations, social media updates, carefully maintained impressions. Most of modern social life is structured around breadth rather than depth, around visibility rather than vulnerability, around staying comfortable rather than becoming known. And every time you attempted to move beneath the surface in spaces that preferred to remain there, you encountered the same invisible resistance. People changed the subject, made a joke, redirected the conversation, moved toward something safer. And even when they did it politely, you felt it. You sensed the moment the door quietly closed. So you adjusted, you smiled, you continued the conversation. But internally, you gathered information. You learned something about that person's capacity for depth. And over time, you developed an increasingly accurate understanding of who could meet you in meaningful places and who could not. That is not judgment. It is observation. It is not coldness. It is awareness. You are not placing people above or below one another. You are simply learning who is capable of holding certain kinds of conversations and who is not. Who remains genuine when things become uncomfortable. Who stays present when uncertainty enters the room. Who can sit with honesty instead of immediately escaping it. And after years of observing those patterns, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Deep connection is rare, not because people are selfish, not because they lack value, but because genuine depth requires courage. It requires self-awareness. It requires a willingness to look inward. And many people have never been encouraged to develop those qualities. So what happens when an empath keeps searching for depth in environments built around surface-level interaction? Usually one of two things. Either they spend years forcing themselves to participate in connections that never truly fit, constantly adapting, constantly performing, constantly trying to belong. Or they stop. They narrow their world. They invest deeply in the few people who have proven they can meet them where they are. And they allow the rest to fade naturally. From the outside, that decision often looks negative. It looks like withdrawal, like isolation, like social failure. Some people interpret it as arrogance. Others see it as avoidance. But from the inside, it feels entirely different. It feels like relief, like finally taking a full breath after holding it for far too long. And that distinction is rarely discussed. The difference between how it appears and how it actually feels. Because viewed from a distance, the empath with fewer friends may seem less connected, less social, less involved. But when you step inside the experience itself, the picture changes completely. You discover space. You discover peace. You discover a level of inner quiet that is difficult to explain to anyone who has never carried. The weight of relationships that demanded too much and returned too little. And within that quiet, something remarkable begins to happen. The empath starts hearing their own voice again. Not the polished version. Not the carefully adjusted version that has learned how to fit comfortably into every room. Not the socially refined version that knows exactly what to say, when to smile, and how to avoid making other people uncomfortable. The real version, the one with thoughts that are sometimes too honest, insights that are sometimes too sharp, emotions that reach depths most casual conversations never touch. The version that quietly waits in the background while the public version handles responsibilities, expectations, and social obligations. And when that authentic self finally has space to breathe, something profound begins to happen. The empath starts experiencing a relationship with themselves that feels more nourishing than many of the relationships they spent years chasing outside themselves. This is the truth at the center of the empath's small circle, and it is a truth that rarely receives permission to be spoken openly. Being alone with yourself when you genuinely know who you are is not an inferior experience to some being surrounded by people who do not. It is simply different, quieter, less visible, less celebrated, but not less meaningful. It asks something of you. It asks you to sit with silence, to tolerate stillness, to listen to your own thoughts without reaching for distraction, to become familiar with your own inner landscape. But it is not a lesser way to live. In many cases, it is where the most significant parts of life unfold, not the parts that attract attention, not the moments that make impressive stories, not the experiences that translate neatly into photographs, updates, or conversations designed to impress strangers. The important parts, the discoveries, the realizations, the moments where you understand what matters to you, what you truly want, what you are willing to fight for, and what you are no longer willing to sacrifice simply to fit into spaces that never felt right. There is a certain clarity that only emerges when the surrounding noise falls quiet enough for to hear what has been underneath it all along. And for many empaths, that clarity becomes one of the most valuable things they ever find. That is why a small circle is not a consolation prize for someone who failed to build a larger one. It is often the result of someone learning the difference between signal and noise, learning which voices enrich their life and which merely fill space, learning what deserves attention and what merely competes for it, and then making a conscious decision about where their energy belongs. Of course, that choice carries a price. There are weekends that feel empty, moments when something funny happens and there is nobody nearby to share it with, days when the silence feels heavier than usual, days when solitude briefly shifts into something more difficult. And because empaths tend to face reality honestly, they do not pretend those moments are easy when they are not. They allow themselves to feel them. They sit with them. They acknowledge them. But they also understand that those moments are not the entire story, because the story includes something else. It includes the rare connections that remain, the relationships where you do not have to edit yourself before speaking, the conversations where honesty is welcomed rather than avoided, the people around whom silence feels comfortable instead of awkward, the people who allow you to leave feeling more like yourself than when you arrived. And even one connection like that carries more value than most people realize. The world encourages you to believe that more is always better. More friends, more invitations, more contacts, more people who recognize your name, more proof that you belong. But those measurements are often focused on the wrong thing. They measure volume, not depth, quantity, not quality. And the reality is that quality is the thing that actually nourishes people. Quality is what sustains them. Quality is what remains when everything superficial fades. And the level of quality an empath is searching for is exceptionally rare. Finding even one person capable of meeting you there is not a fallback option. It is an achievement, a genuine one. There is also a particular form of strength that rarely receives recognition. It does not dominate a room. It does not draw attention to itself. It does not announce its presence through confidence, popularity, or social influence. It is far quieter than that, more private, more enduring. It develops gradually through years of choosing truth over performance, depth over appearance, meaning over approval, solitude over company that requires you to abandon yourself. It is the strength of someone who has spent enough time paying attention to know exactly who they are, what they need, what restores them, and what they are no longer willing to sacrifice simply to keep other people comfortable. From the outside, that strength can be misunderstood. Some people mistake it for isolation. Others call it difficulty. Some assume it is evidence that someone struggled socially and eventually stopped trying. But those interpretations miss the reality entirely, because the empath with few friends has often accomplished something many people avoid for their entire lives. They have spent time with themselves honestly, not the curated version, not the version designed to earn approval, not the version crafted to look impressive from a distance, the complete version, the complicated version, the sensitive version, the intense version, the version with contradictions and vulnerabilities and needs that do not always fit neatly into society's expectations. And instead of running from that reality, they stayed with it. They faced it. They listened to it. They learned from it. They chose presence over distraction. And when you think about it carefully, that may be one of the rarest forms of courage a person can possess, because many people are uncomfortable with their own inner world. Not in a way they would openly admit, but watch how quickly silence gets filled. Watch how often people reach for stimulation the moment they are left alone with themselves. Watch how many identities are built almost entirely from external validation, from approval, from attention, from inclusion, from the constant reassurance that someone else is there to confirm their value. The empath who has learned to sit comfortably within their own company begins needing less of that reassurance, not because they have stopped caring about people, but because they have finally discovered something many spend their entire lives searching for outside themselves. A relationship with themselves that no longer depends on constant external confirmation. Most people have, in subtle ways, outsourced large parts of their identity to the social environment around them, which means that when that environment changes, when friendships fade, when relationships end, when groups evolve and move forward, they don't just lose people. They lose access to parts of themselves they didn't realize were being held in those connections.